Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica, and I am here with
Balaban, and it's good to be here.
It's good to have you here at Turn the Page Syosset Library podcast. So Bob is a multi-talented actor, author, producer, director. Sometimes you were in the movie version of Catch-22.
That was one of my first movies. I was just barely out of college, and I started working there. I came to New York. I started at Colgate University because I had no idea what I wanted to do or be or anything, even though I did, of course, always want to be some form of actor or writer or director or something, but I couldn't admit it quite. And I came to New York, and I got cast as Linus in Your Good Man, Charlie Brown. So I began working when I was about 21 or 20 years old, and then got into some movies, Catch-22 being one of them, which was also one of my favorite books. So it was very, very exciting to be in a movie that had been one of my favorite books.
I think Catch-22 is one of those just enduring titles that no matter how far you get from its publication, it's continuously read and enjoyed, and thought about and quoted, and so that's very cool.
Well, it even created the word "it's a catch-22" situation, which I think a fair amount of people use that word
and don't know
where idea what it was based on.
Right, of course.
And I was in another movie that became somewhat iconic, although it wasn't based on anything. Close Encounters of the Third Kind,
which is what I was going to get to next.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I was just gonna very briefly say the phrase "it's a close encounter of the third kind" became part of the lexicon, but only limitedly. I don't think people use it as much as they say Catch-22 anymore, but it sure was popular for a while.
I actually do still hear it mentioned. Was that the first time it was actually used? Was for the movie Close Encounters?
No, the phrase "Close Encounters of the Third Kind" is based on a book.
Oh, yes, okay.
By the wonderful man whose name I will try to remember in a moment, who was a scientist. He was an astronomer. He worked at a university, and he was the head of Project Blue Book, which the government had designated to see if there were really any kind of foreign flying objects out there that were, flying saucers or unknown, unidentified UFOs. So his name was Dr. Alan J. Hynek, and he oversaw this for about 10 or 20 years, then wrote a book called Close Encounters of the First, Second, and Third Kind. That's approximately the title. So it was only well known to other scientists or people who were interested in UFOs. And then when they made the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and it had the title of his book.
Alan Hynek, was it?
Alan J. Hynek,
yes.
And he was a real expert in UFOs. He was a scientist. He was a legitimate astronomer, and he did, over the course of 20 years of research, locate a fair amount of objects that were unidentified flying objects. Only at the end of Project Blue Book, the government announced that there was no such thing as an unidentified flying object, and then they closed the story on that. And Dr. Hynek, being a scientist, really would never go any further publicly,
right,
than saying it was unidentified. It wasn't weather, it wasn't this. Yeah. We did every test in the world. Nobody claims responsibility for it. But on the other hand, he had taken some pictures which were pretty scary looking.
It's funny because I know, that, a lot of people talk about UFOs, unidentified flying objects. And the refrain usually is, well, it just means it was a flying object that we didn't know what it was. So literally, to say there's no UFOs, there are flying objects that they're unidentified. So that's very funny. But that movie, the Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was very iconic, and that was the 5-tone message. Dun, 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 that
idea, Steven Spielberg's imagination, which nobody is in a doubt that he has a great one, really was amazing. That he conceived of a 20-minute sequence in the movie where nobody almost said a word except tones of music went back and forth in a movie that was just spellbinding, even when nobody was doing anything. And the idea that this these beings from another planet, I mean, that, it made it all seem plausible in some way. And he did try to make it be very much like whatever Alan J. Hynek said in his book.
It really was, and that's another, that's another thing. That music, it pops up in just a lot of things, and I know what it's a reference to, but I wonder sometimes if the people everybody who's watching it, like for instance, there was a movie that my kids like, Monsters versus Aliens, and I think
Mm-hmm.
Stephen Colbert played the president, and there was the scene where that came up, and then he starts playing something on the piano, and my husband and I are like, oh, Close Encounters, but it's pretty cool, just the far
Well,
reaching.
we're almost getting into word derivations now, because I'm sure you enjoy them, being involved with books and literature a lot. But some of my favorite derivations, tawdry being one of them, is we use many of these words in our regular vocabulary. And when you find out that they're based on a real person, that if you're tawdry and that means you're sort of cheap and shabby, that goes back to St. Audrey, who they had a day called St. Audrey's Day that became St. Audrey became tawdry. And if she was kind of cheap and shoddy, and yet she was a saint. And we're referring to a real human being whenever we use that word, and many thousands of other words like that.
There's one that is interesting to me, is villain, which I recently found out was referred to more. It wasn't so much like a bad person, but it referred to people who were not wealthy, the poor class,
Oh,
like way
yeah.
back when. So that's very interesting, because you say supervillain, and people are like, oh, a supervillain, a terrible person, and many times supervillains are very wealthy also, and using their wealth for bad things. But it's interesting when you look at the history of it, and you're just like, wait, how did that happen?
Well, it gives you a little glimpse into the rich and the poor, and how rich people felt about poor people.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
So with Close Encounters, you wrote a book, a diary of behind the scenes.
I did. It was originally called The Close Encounters Diary. I had kept something of a diary during the making of the movie, and then I made the rest up after I sold it as a book. It actually had an odd beginning. I went when I After I finished Close Encounters, right after I finished it, I had my first child, Mariah, and but while while my wife was pregnant, she said, you never finished college. You should go back to college, because what kind of an example is that to your child? Their father didn't go to college, and then we expect her to go to college. So I
Right.
went back to college, and I had to take two courses that they basically had to be self-contained, so I didn't have to actually go anywhere. And one of my courses was a sociology course, and I had to write about social stratification. I could choose a topic, and I chose social stratification on a film set, and wrote a sociological lengthy treatise on what it was like during Close Encounters. Uh, what was the social stratification like? How could you tell the difference between the director and the extras, and the people who were billed as actors and the people who were less famous? And I was at a party. I was talking about this paper I had written that I got an A on from my teacher. And somebody there was from a newspaper, and they printed that I had written a behind the scenes diary of one of the greatest movies of all time. And I got 3 offers to make it into a book. And I took out all the sociological references, and I turned it into a book, which was pretty adhered to the facts of everything, of my experience of being a very small actor on a very big movie. And that was the first book I wrote. Not that I'm much of a book writer, but I did write a couple.
You've done some children's books, McGraw, about a dog.
Yep. I was trying to sell a movie to Scholastic, the publishing company, because they did Harry Potter, so they had a kind of a film division. And I went with about a long treatment for a movie about a little girl who had a bionic dog. And they said, well, we don't really develop movies too much, even though we're the movie department. But how would you like to make this into 6 books that would be a series of books about a little boy and his bionic dog? Because he can have a best friend who's a girl, but we're in the market between 6 years old and 10 years old, where girls are much more quick to pick up a book than boys are. I guess it's somewhat developmental and somewhat sociological or whatever. So they said it would be very helpful. Would you mind making the lead character a boy? And then the girl can be a big character. She can be important. But the person who has the dog has to be a boy. And they gave me a bunch of other caveats. And I went and wrote 6 books that actually became somewhat best-selling books. I did it for about 4 years. And I really admire people who write series of books that sometimes go on for 20 and 30
Oh,
books.
absolutely.
And after my 3rd book came out, I used to get some fan mail from kids, and they write to the publisher, and the publisher gives you the letter. And I read my letter and it said, "Dear Mr. Balaban, I'm 8 years old. I'm in 3rd grade, and I really enjoyed your first 2 books. But now I've read the 3rd book, and the stories are all the same. Why must they always be kidnapped? Why does the dog always have to get kidnapped? And why does the little boy and his friend always have to go searching for him, etc.? Surely you were so imaginative in the first 2 books. Can't you keep being imaginative and make stuff up?" And she said, "I hope you're not mad at me." And I immediately wrote her back and I said, "Well, I agree with you. It's kind of hard hewing to the rules of what has to happen in serialized books."
Right.
But then I went to the publisher, and we were only doing 6 of them. And I said to the publisher, what if in the 6th book they don't get kidnapped? What if it's a whole different story? What it's about the dog falling in love and having puppies and other things? And the publisher said, "Sure, that's fine." So I dedicated it to this really smart, nice little girl who had written in, and I thought it was actually very courageous to write to an adult and criticize them in a very nice way.
Sure.
She wasn't about it, but that girl's going to get somewhere maybe, and I think she did. And I said to her, "You'll be surprised. Go buy the 6th book." And it says dedicated to. And I said, "And it'll surprise you," because it was such a relief for me to write the 6th book, knowing that I could let it go wherever my imagination took me. And it was one of my favorites of the 6 of them.
That's very cool, and it's interesting because I mean the landscape of children's literature has shifted a lot recently, and we are seeing a lot more books with the female protagonists. I
Yes.
think it's definitely interesting, and I know that in the past people had thought that boys wouldn't pick up a book with a female protagonist, but as a children's librarian, I've definitely seen, it's not like things are, like a quick movement, but it's definitely a movement that I see, and I'm so glad that you were able to make that both that little girl's wish come true, and also write something that was just so close to your heart and really allowed you to spread that creativity.
Well, it was fun because when I thought of it as being a movie, this all went back to both of my daughters, but especially my younger daughter Hazel. From the time she could talk, she was, "When are we going to get a dog?" And we used to say, "Well, in 2 years after this happens, we come back from here." And she kind of caught on at one point and said, "This is never going to happen, is it?" I said, "Well, unfortunately, it probably isn't." So the impulse to write a book about a child who just has dog DNA in their soul, which is true. I think an awful lot of children, unless they're scared of dogs, or I'm sure some people don't care about dogs, but there are so many people who do, that it was good to base the book on an impulse, because whatever age you're writing for, and then I did write briefly a series called The Creature from the 7th Grade,
Which is awesome, by the way. I
Well,
love that. I love that series.
Thank you. I had a really good time. We aborted it in the middle of it because it seemed as though the graphics on the cover, as well as the title, sort of created a conundrum in people who were purchasing children's books. Because if it's a creature from the 7th grade, it should be aspirational. So only people who are in the 3rd and 4th grade will read it, and people in the 7th grade would never read it because it seems too childish. And that had a million reasons why it wasn't doing very well. But interesting, with children's books, like movies, it's not unlike the movie business, where I'm also somewhat involved, where a title and a picture of something can instantly make millions of people want to go to see that movie. even if they didn't see a trailer. And with children's books, it's not like you're always buying a well-known author, and especially in the 6 to kind of 9 or 10-year-old category. You're going by the feeling that you get when you encounter just looking at the book. Now, in Scholastic's case, they actually bring books into the schoolroom, so they have a big jump on everybody. And they really are very good, I think, for it's
They
good for
are,
kids.
yeah.
They get an exposure without their parents having to take them to a store necessarily. But really, it's all instinctive, and I think I'm glad you liked my Creature from the Seventh Grade. I labored heavily over it.
It was really cute. I mean, it was really cute. I mean, seventh grade is tough, and I really thought it was just a fun look at all the changes that happen in seventh grade, and it was just very tongue in cheek. How I know that the plot of it is that this character he turns he's in seventh grade and he changes into
a dinosaur.
And there was something where oh well, didn't you know on your grandmother's side or something there was dinosaur. It was just very cute, and I thought it was so much fun. I really did.
It was hard to write for me. I could write a great proposal. I wrote a first chapter that was really fun, and that's how it occurred to me. But the first books were for younger kids, and I could be sillier. And I'm somewhat silly by nature when I'm not being not silly. And I had a real impulse for the book. In Creature from the Seventh Grade, I had a somewhat generic impulse, which there are an awful lot of kids' books written about people who are different. So this was clearly about people who were different. But I didn't have the wherewithal to finally calibrate what it meant to be writing for seventh graders. And the editor was she was just great. She kept gently, like directing a person when you're acting. You can't just say that's terrible. Do it like somebody else who's actually good. But she basically kept steering me away from easy, silly things, and really, as much as the book is a comedy, getting me to be involved with real behavior, and it's much easier to write things that you believe in than that you're making up because you want it to be like a certain kind of book. And I did get kind of in a groove eventually, and by that time it was the third book was over and we ended the series. But I had a really good time in it. If I ever dare do this again, I think I would only write a one-off book. I don't think I would get into the serial business, even though it can be enormously lucrative.
I think as I think you were saying before, there's just so much pressure to keep going, and but it was really fun and adorable, and it's interesting because having worked in the children's department, and just remembering the books that we read when we were children. Like, everybody wanted to read about, when you were in elementary school, you wanted to read about that mysterious middle schooler or that mysterious high schooler. And I remember, my cousin was really into Sweet Valley High. And, she's maybe in 5th grade and reading about these Sweet Valley High teenagers who were kind of cutthroat and, but she just ate it up. And high school seemed like, again, this magical place, which, high school is another trying time for a lot of people, but that's what sold to that age group, really. I mean, and they ate them like Doritos, those books.
When they say aspirational, I think it doesn't mean you just want to be like those people. It means, what's going to happen in the future? I want to get a glimpse of something that I'm not allowed to be part of. So I do think that's great. Yeah.
It's funny. There was a movie, and now I'm what was that movie? I can't now. I can't remember.
Give me a try. What was it kind of about? Maybe
it was kind of Dazed and Confused. That's what it was.
I can never remember the title of that movie.
Yeah.
He's a wonderful director. He lives in Austin, Texas, and it was Mariah's favorite movie, and she had 10 posters on her wall.
Everybody loved that movie, and I remember
except people's parents.
Except for people's parents, yes. And there's a bunch of movies like that. but I remember like my cousin was coming into ninth grade and I was a little older than him. And like he like literally thought that guys were, like the upperclassmen were going to chase after freshmen and, like harass them. And I mean, maybe it happens in some places. Maybe it was more prevalent during the time period that the movie took place. But I was like, yeah, no, not, I've not seen that. He's like, well, but in Days Confused, so it's interesting, people they worry about the future and their media
Yeah.
becomes a mirror of either their concerns or their aspirations.
Yeah. I,
Um,
I had read a book that my wife brought to me, and we tried to option it, and it was so popular when she was little. I wonder if you ever came across it, called The All of a Kind Family. Is this
yes,
a
and
title you know?
it still goes out. There are still people who come in and want all of a kind family.
I'm so happy to hear it. They did try. I tried to make it into a television series. Which was a far reach. This was about 25 years ago, and cable had not widened the narrow lanes that some of these things had to be in. And also, the author was alive at the time, and I realized as I started mapping out how to stretch this out, because every little book was almost its own one episode, and there were enough for one season, but not enough for, if this became popular. And I finally came to the writer, and she was great, Sydney Howard, I think. I'm not sure what her last name, but her name was Sydney. Um, and I said, I don't think you should let this book be sold into television or movies, because you're never going to get them. They won't ever allow you to have final approval over these things. And yet you should have it, because this is your life that you're writing about. Everything in it was directly taken from an experience she had with her family or her family's friends. And she passed away 20 years later. And I think people are now trying to make it, which won't make her miserable because she's not around to be miserable. And they may
Right.
make it into a lovely thing. But when it's your life, it's very scary to have it be made.
I just looked it up. Sydney Taylor?
Sydney Taylor, that's true.
Yes.
Sydney Howard is a famous other person. Sydney Taylor did write about 10, I think, all of the kind family
Yes.
books about a somewhat traditional Jewish family about, I think in the 50s, I think this thing took place, or maybe the 40s. I think and there's a library lady who's a very important character. And strangely enough, it was definitely about a Jewish family, and they were traditional, but the way it was written, you didn't feel like, oh, I'm looking at something that's so private or so different for me that I can't get involved with it. In fact, it was the opposite. Like many things, by being very, very specific about the lives of these kids, even though they were writing for
Mm-hmm.
pretty young kids, it was very realistic, and it enabled anybody from any walk of life to be involved, because all families are alike,
Right.
and only in being specific about them do the realities come out. And yet, and it's you think you would think it wouldn't have had as broad an audience as it had, and it really did, because the writer was so good at emotion and honest, and what was honestly going on with his family.
Yeah, they really, again, I mean, they really are still popular. People still want to read them. People still take them
Mm-hmm.
out. When you talk about authors who, I guess, the question is, are they necessarily, depending on how they feel about their books, are they happy to see them be turned into movies or not? I think famously, there's always, is it Travers, P.L. Travers from Mary
Oh yeah,
Poppins, who just hated.
they made a movie later on, as you probably remember,
Yes.
with Emma Thompson, about how much she hated Disney and for making the movie. And I mean, to me, that was a very charming depiction of things. But I grew up loving the movie The Wizard of Oz.
Right.
And Mariah read all the L. Frank Baum books, and she said, "I will never go to see that movie, because that is so not like what L. Frank Baum
Oh,
was
so
writing." And
much.
yet
Yeah,
it
yeah.
enchanted the kids who didn't read the book.
It's funny because we would have that, on a reading list, or people who are familiar with the movie, and they'll come in and they'll say, well, is it like the movie? And I'll say, literally the first page is pretty much like the movie, that Dorothy lives with her aunt and uncle in Kansas, and a tornado comes, and that's where the similarities basically end. It becomes a completely different
Mm-hmm.
story after that. Not to say that it's bad, it's good. Just, if you're going to ask me if it's similar, that to me is, the and of course you do have the witches, but it's such a different world, and it's this it's really this rich world. And I think Gregory, what was who wrote Wicked?
Uh
Um,
huh. Well,
uh,
the book Wicked, yeah.
Gregory Maguire. Yeah, the book one. Yeah, he really dug into L. Frank Baum's world of Oz in those
Hmm.
books, however obscure they are. And I remember there's like a encyclopedia of Oz here, and going back and being like, oh, the three adepts, that is a thing in in the greater world. So it's interesting.
Well, the the whole Oz phenomenon, when they did a modern, I can't remember his name right now, but a wonderful director who did the who I believe did the movie about the sheepdog that was so good. It was Babe, who I think they and the original, the first version of Babe was very close to what the book was like. It was very charming. The
Yes.
second one was very, very dark. But I think it was that director who did a Wizard of Oz remake with Fairuza Balk, who I have a very
Oh,
good such an
it was yes,
enthusiastic
I
memory.
remember
And it
when I
was
had insomnia as a child, that was on one night, and then I had more insomnia. Not that I
it
didn't
was
enjoy
so
it. It was
terrifying
so
that
terrifying.
but that's what the Oz books were
Yes.
actually. And it's interesting because when you're I think for children they can sometimes read about these things and use their own imaginations to make it a little less scary
Yes.
maybe, or it's not quite the same as encountering the
Mhm.
music that makes you scared and the actor that's so terrifying with a nose that's twice as long as you imagined it in this story.
Yeah.
I'm always amazed at Harry Potter, um, that the first one or two Harry Potters, the movies were about as gentle as the books felt to be, and then as the books got a little more grown up
Mhm.
in their description of things, the filmmaking got more grown up and more, and now I'm just amazed that kids aren't terrified of Harry Potter, and in general, I don't see too many people traumatized by either the books or the beautifully made but very, to me, adult movies in the sense of
Yes.
danger.
And it's so lovely, so beautifully scored. They did such they were so smart with how they made the movies. And I know there's a lot of divisiveness, but I think they did a good job. And one of the things they did was the score. Was it? I think John Williams did the score, who's always
He's a
great.
wonder. He did Close Encounters, and he did
Yes,
almost.
he
I
did.
think he scored just about everything that Steven Spielberg ever made.
And but in not putting like the popular music of the time in making it its own bubble, those movies can, they're not going to be as dated. And I have movies that I adore, but like as soon as the soundtrack comes on, you're just like, oh, this was an 80s movie, or and
Yeah.
they're fun. But I feel like, and I remember like back in the day when I did do film classes, that was like one of the things they were talking about, um, making something for the time, and then making something that's gonna stay in its own little bubble. And I think they did a very good job with that.
Uh-huh. I was very impressed.
Do you do you, I mean, this is such the boilerplate question, do you have a favorite movie that you worked on? And then later I want to come just really quickly back to books, because you narrated Thunderstruck by Eric Larson,
Yes, I did.
which he's one of my favorite nonfiction authors. He's
Me
just
too.
fantastic.
It's really fun to read a book on tape. And in the couple that I've done, they do take a tremendous amount of time because you're actually reading the whole book, although they abridge some of them. But I was in Thunderstruck, I didn't know what was going to happen because I hadn't read the book before because I was kind of busy. And reading a book out loud when you're discovering what's happening is can be, and it was for me, a really, once I got rolling with how do you do this animal, how much do you act out, how much of it sounds like you're reading a book, etc. Once you feel comfortable, it was really fun to discover while I was being recorded what was happening. Um, and I became I was always a fan of Eric Larson, but being inside of it, reading the book that way, uh, really gave me a greater insight into his talents, which I think are enormous.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he really, like, he can really put you in a time period, and he sets a mood. what is it? The one, the Devil in the White City, which
They're
what
finally making that into a movie.
that was my question, because I remember like years and years ago, like over 5 years ago, hearing that this was going to happen and that Scorsese was going to be involved. But then it hasn't happened. But it's fine. It's finally happening.
I keep hearing that it's happening, so it probably is. And I think part of it, in some ways, adapting a classic book is much harder than adapting a kind of a good book that people didn't really know that much about, and maybe it needed fixing a little bit. But when you go to make Gone with the Wind, you better know what you're doing. And in the case of Gone with the Wind, they really did, but they did have to fire a wonderful director to get to the director who was able to make the movie.
Right.
And Catch 22, to go back to that, suffered a lot from being, at the time, I can't think of another book except maybe Harry Potter, but I think even Catch 22 even reached a broader audience than that, and it was so beloved, you literally couldn't change anything.
Yeah.
And the humor that works when you read it is not the same as the humor that necessarily works when you film it. And I think Catch 22 really turned out rather well, but the audience was waiting to shoot it down,
Yes.
and critics were too. It was just too well known and too popular and too beloved.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I think my other favorite Larson book was favorite. It's really terrifying, but in the Garden of the Beasts, I just tore through that book, and
Yeah, me too.
I was like sitting on the Long Island Railroad, meeting up with a friend with like my hands shaking and my knuckles white, like, just reading the story as it unfolded, and seeing, I don't think I'd ever read anything from that perspective based in pre-World War II Germany.
Right.
And it was really good. So that's cool.
And I, to the extent I knew what he was writing about,
Mm-hmm.
it does seem there is great verisimilitude, I think, which makes it more frightening, because he didn't have to make up any fake things to terrify you. It was just terrifying.
Exactly. It was really great. A great book about horrible things, but so do you have like a favorite favorite movie, favorite that's really close to your heart?
Yes.
Or is oh, good. Okay, I was going to say, is playing favorites like not a thing you can say?
Well, I have a lot of favorites, and of course, when you say favorite movie, does it mean it was your favorite part, or did you have a good experience while you were making it, or what is it? But I must say, I loved working with a lot of the great directors I was lucky enough to work with. Steven Spielberg being one of them. Yes, being in Close Encounters.
Of course.
Tremendous experience. Getting to be friends with Francois Truffaut and watching a great filmmaker from up close for 8 or 9 months really, really was great. I've loved the Chris Guest series of movies that I made, all of them.
I really, those are so much fun. I love them, and I think like A Mighty Wind, my friend and I just like sometimes we'll just text each other random quotes from A Mighty Wind like years and years after we saw it in the theater.
Yeah, I loved it too. The sad thing about those movies is when you're there's nothing written down. I mean, it does say they now talk about going on stage, or maybe they have a fight about something, but it doesn't tell you anything to say in particular. And being in it, you are part of, and you witness some of the most amazing things you've ever seen that never made it into a movie, because they would have to be a 5-hour movie, and
That's too bad.
and they can't do it. So a comedy especially can't be an hour and 20 minutes. It shouldn't be. They're usually about 90 minutes. So a lot of great things do get left on the cutting room floor, but it was a real pleasure to be in those things. I've done a couple of Wes Anderson movies, and he is really wonderful to work with. And when I look back, I do think of Moonrise Kingdom as a highlight. I mean, I have had a certain amount of, for me, highlights, not necessarily would anybody else be highlighted by my highlight. But I love the movie. I love being a part of it. I love my costume. I love the scenery. I love the other actors. And I love being in a little bit of a repertory company. There are people who have been in all 19 of Wes's movies.
Yeah.
I've only been in the last 4, but it's really nice to be in a repertory company in movies. And you don't realize it when you're watching it necessarily, but in 100 years, when they drag out the Wes Anderson movies and everybody binge watches all 45 of them that there'll be at that point, It's so much fun to look. Oh, he's playing that part, and this person's playing that part, and now they're switching, and now he's the good guy, and now he's the bad guy in the next three of these. It was a great experience, and I happen to love the movie, but I just loved everything about it, as
My
I do with his movies in general.
That's actually Moonrise Kingdom is one of my husband's. I mean, I love it. It's one of my favorites, but it's one of my husband's favorite of all time. He
Yeah,
just adored it so much, and yeah, that was a really good one. And I think like was it after that one? And I don't know, if you had seen there was a skit on Saturday Night Live, like it was a spoof, like a horror movie as it would have looked like directed by Wes Anderson, like the
I
Midnight
think I saw it.
Coterie of
Yeah, yeah.
Sinister and something like that. And it was very well done, and it was very funny. And I remember my husband being like, "I would so watch that."
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, no, but Moonrise Kingdom is out of all of them, that's probably my favorite too. And I do enjoy Wes Anderson.
yeah. Me too.
Um, so that's so
Now, is
that
your
oh
library? May I ask you a question?
sure.
Is your library aimed at a particular age group, or like all libraries, you have categories of books in every category?
Yes, we have categories in every category. We and it's interesting. We try. We're looking, and this is how I kind of look at libraries in general. They're for everybody, and going back to Harry Potter, I think Harry Potter is one of those books, those series that adults and children read at the same time as they were
Very
coming out.
unusual.
Very unusual. And when the fourth one came out, I remember I was in the city once, and I'm sitting on the subway and I'm reading it, and the two people across from me are reading it, and the guy leaning up against the door is reading it, and it was just a very special experience.
Yeah.
So I think yeah. So we have a children's area, which is Ames birth through about fifth, sixth grade. We have a teen space upstairs. We have readers services, which is just a fiction. But then there's also crossover for some, because a lot of adults like to read young adult books. So
Hmm.
we have. But I mean, I think like libraries are expanding spaces, and we're more than just books, obviously, because we're doing a podcast and talking about movies and books. But we've started to venture into just events. We're having our second Comic-Con. I should actually not Comic-Con, sorry. Pop culture convention event coming up in September. And
Specific to your library,
specific to our library, it's called SciCon. Um,
right?
yeah, and the first one brought in, I think, like close to 2,700 people.
That's tremendous, and it help and it does what you have to try to find a million ways to do it that don't make it look like you're doing it.
Yeah,
You're exposing people to reading and getting people possibly to be interested who weren't interested.
yeah, and it's also it's opening our space to just different thoughts. And I mean, this is kind of what we've always been doing. Just as the culture changes, we change with it. And some people said that oh, you're getting VHS in your library, oh, that's terrible, it's only for that. It's not, it's just we're expanding
We
to
can't
reach what
pretend that the
people.
rest of the world isn't happening while our world
Yes.
is happening.
Yeah, so it's I mean, we're a space for everybody and everything. And I also like to when we're looking at programming for this podcast, we're open to everything, because that is what libraries are.
Did you study library science in college?
I have my master's in library science. I studied film theory in college.
Really? So,
Yes,
but there's a relation, but obviously a strong relation between the two because they're both two ways of telling stories.
exactly.
Were
And
you,
I,
were you,
oh no, go ahead.
well, I don't want to, you were about to say something that sounded interesting.
Oh, you were about to ask something that sounded interesting.
Did you read a lot when you were a little kid?
So I didn't. I was a reluctant reader, and it took finding the right book to make me a big reader, which is why I had so much passion for it later in life, because I realized that it is about getting the right book in the hands of, the right person, the right child. My brother, he took to reading even later than I did, but he's now an English teacher for high school.
This may be a pattern in your family.
I think so. I think it is.
What was the book?
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
That's a great book.
Yes, it is. I really and ironically, it is. Ironically, I don't know if this is really ironic, but it was the movie version was one of my first dates with my husband. So,
Wow.
yes.
Did you like Did you feel the movie lived up to the book well?
I felt like it was a very good adaptation. I felt that it kept the heart of certain things, but you can't. You can't, you're translating it, and I thought it was a very good translation.
Great. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you have any feelings about it?
I never saw the movie.
Oh, that's okay.
But I wondered, because it's such a classic, if it was able to find its way, because it's a translation, and then you have to feel when you see it like it's captured the book without capturing literally the book, because it usually doesn't work that way.
No, that's the thing about adaptations. I mean, you kind of do have to expect that there are things that are going to have to be changed for different reasons, but there are ways to translate well. And I felt like, at least with the first one, I hadn't seen any of the sequels. I felt like that translation was done very well.
How big is your library?
We have a lot of space. We have right now we record in the basement. So we have a basement with some meeting rooms. Then we have a main level. Then we have a mezzanine, and we have a reader services floor. And then we have a floor on the very top, which has cool things like our 3D printer and Cricut machine. But we do have a lot of really wonderful staff here.
Well, I'm very interested in libraries because my daughter Mariah's boyfriend is a librarian.
Really? Where
Yeah,
is he a librarian?
Well, I know it's somewhere. It's on the outskirts of Chicago in a suburb, and I don't know exactly what it's called, but I believe it's near a little town called Des Plaines, and it's a big undertaking to run a library, and he's obviously very good at it, as you are.
Oh, thank you so much. And I do know that the libraries in Chicago suburbs, from people I know who live there, are very, very nice. So he's very lucky. So just to wrap things up, is there anything that you're working on now that you love, or is it all under wraps?
I'm doing a lot of different things. I just finished doing something for Netflix that will be on in the fall that I'm looking forward to it being on. I acted in it.
Cool.
I'm acting in a series right now based on 3 Days of the Condor, the Robert Redford movie with Faye Dunaway. That's a lot of fun to work on. We did a season about a year and a half ago, actually, almost 2 years went by, and now we're doing a second season. So I'm in Toronto, flying back and forth whenever I can, having a really good time. And I develop a lot of stuff, that some of which is theater. I'm developing a play based on a documentary that John Siskel and his directing partner directed, called Louder Than a Bomb, about a slam poetry competition in Chicago. It's a wonderful documentary, and we're working on developing that into a play. I could go on too long if you allowed me to, but the idea is I just direct a lot of different things. I'm also trying to make a series out of a podcast from This American Life.
Oh, nice.
Which, speaking of things that aren't books, but that are the equivalent of spoken books, the American Life series is. And I wonder, do they publish that as a book? Because wouldn't you think it would be a great book if they
I
published?
do, and I'd have to look into if they publish it. What I was going to say is Welcome to Night Vale, which was a huge podcast, kind of horror camp, and it was cool because it kind of took you back to that radio serial world. That has been published into books. So I wouldn't be surprised. I have to go look, but I wouldn't be surprised if This American Life has some publication attached to it.
Well, I optioned one of my favorite ones called Petty Tyrant. Obviously, they're all true stories, and I'm now in the process of trying to sell it and develop it and make it be some form of a television series. But I think for you and for me and for the whole world, people love stories.
Uh,
So
yes. And that's and this is a really good place to stop, because this goes back to what I was going to say before when we were bantering about the interesting question or the interesting statement. What took me away from film theory, or just working in film in general, was I realized the base of what I loved was the story, and that is what led me to become a librarian.
that's a great thing to know. And it's a story unlike a movie that well, now you can take movies with you under the covers, but until about
Exactly.
3 minutes ago, and if you really wanted to get involved with the story and make it your own, it had to be a book. It goes everywhere with you, and you can take it out at any time. You can start it and stop it. You can read it in sections.
Hmm.
And books are can cover so much more, because you could take 3 weeks to read a really dense, interesting book. And I don't think you could get people to come to your 3 week movie. It's hard to get people to stay more than 2 hours in a movie.
True.
So obviously, they each do things differently, but they do things exactly the same, because we need stories. We need stories to remind us of our lives and to show us what other lives are like. And we need them to have perspective on a world that's even more difficult to understand than it ever was.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bob.
It was really fun talking to you, and I'm glad we finally did this. Let's do it. Let's do a follow up in 2 years
Yes,
and see where
let's.
we are.
Maybe when your when the This American Life story has been but we'll follow up again then.
From your mouth.
Okay. Thank you so much, and we're going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.